Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today for the Howland Memorial Festival Seeding Resistance Lecture Series. My name is Elizabeth Hoover, and I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department at UC Berkeley. And my talk today, if we can just get our slides uploaded here, is called Our Living Relatives, Seed Rematriation and the Native American Food Sovereignty Movement. So just to kind of start by defining food sovereignty, La Via Campesina, a peasant organization from Latin America that has really spread all over the world to represent the needs of land-based communities trying to raise their own food, has defined food sovereignty as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their rights to define their own food and agriculture systems. Now, specifically for Indigenous communities, people have added on some of these other layers to some of these food sovereignty definitions to include the importance of recognizing social, cultural, and economic relationships. And that's the relationships that people are especially focusing on that underlie community food sharing and that need to be nurtured. And these include some of the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based foods and political systems. And in many communities, this starts, as you can see here, with these girls learning how to garden with the youth, and it's connected to other cultural programs. So why are there movements now to try to revitalize some of these systems? What happened to diminish that and cause there to be a need for food sovereignty and seed sovereignty movements? I know part of this series is focused on the idea of a sixth extinction. So a massive decline in biodiversity, including seed diversity, because of climate change and anthropogenic efforts. And within Native communities, some of these anthropogenic efforts and climate change are very linked and have been so since the beginning of first contact here, since settler colonialism became a way of overtaking this continent. And so Kyle White is a Potawatomi philosopher, and I highly encourage you to read some of his work looking at how the first big climate change for Native people occurred because of being relocated from traditional homelands to other spaces where settler governments shunted people off to. So some of the first challenges to indigenous food and seed systems here in the US started with scorched earth battle tactics that included, for Haudenosaunee people in the 17th century, it was the French who came through and burned people's cornfields as a way of trying to weaken the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And George Washington encouraged General Sullivan to do much the same in the 1700s, in the late 1700s, as part of the American Revolution. He instructed Sullivan to lay waste to their settlements and so to weaken Haudenosaunee villages by burning all of their food stores as well as the food that was in the fields. This also happened for Navajo people who were relocated from their homelands to a concentration camp. And Kit Carson and other figures for people who did not readily relocate, they would burn their orchards and their crops and their sheep. So there was an intentional targeting of food systems and the destruction of those food systems as a way of weakening these communities. There was also outright theft of land and forced relocation. So most notably, the people have heard of the Trail of Tears, when Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole people were relocated out of the southeast part of the US off to Oklahoma. There were many other tribes that were also taken from their homelands and moved down to Oklahoma. And this made it challenging. If you have seeds that do well in South Carolina or do well in Kansas or Nebraska, they're not necessarily going to grow as well in Oklahoma. And it was also very difficult for people to pack up all of their seeds and farming supplies for these death marches, essentially. The allotment period, so the Dawes Act of 1887, took communally held land that was already diminished from people's original homeland sizes and then split it up into individually held parcels. And then the extra land was then sold off to settler farmers who wanted to come and farm that land. And so this further diminished the amount of land that people had on which to produce food. There was also the boarding school era in the 1870s in many places, but on the East Coast, taking children from their families for a forced re-education started even earlier. So essentially you had this notion of kill the Indian, save the man, as Pratt notioned. He was one of the founders of some of these boarding schools. And so the effort was to completely re-educate people so that they would not be learning their traditional languages, their own ways of growing food and food systems, but instead would be learning a Euro-American Western style of doing things. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, that's what the BIA is, also came to reservations and really promoted a Western farming method and the hybrid seeds, and tried to push that on communities as a way of producing food, even for people who had been farming for thousands of years. The notion was, no, these Western ways of plowing things up and having individually held patches of land and irrigating were the best plan. And it often didn't work for many communities. During the same time, though, you had non-native seed collectors who were going around and collecting heirloom seeds from native communities and then using those in their own seed catalogs and breeding their own seed stock that they were selling to settler farmers based on these seeds that were collected from native communities. Some of the contemporary challenges to indigenous food and seed systems is climate change. So when you have seeds that are very well adapted to a particular place, to a particular growing season, that becomes challenging when it's harder to predict what years are going to be really wet, what years are going to be really dry, or when the frosts are going to come or not. There's concerns about cross-contamination with GMO seeds. So if you are planting an heirloom corn, like some of this Haudenosaunee white corn you see hanging in the background, but your neighbor not that far away is planting a commodity corn crop for sale, either for animal feed or for high fructose corn syrup, there's concern about that pollen drifting back and forth and contaminating those heirloom seeds. Some communities don't have a lot of land on which to farm. Some individuals who would be interested in being seed savers have a hard time accessing land, tools, and seed. And some people say, well, there's just not as much interest. And I think in recent years, that's really changing, and more people really are becoming interested in saving heirloom seeds specifically, and not just going to the store to buy seeds. So having food systems dramatically altered because of all of these challenges and all these threats to native seed systems has led to very particular health and economic impacts in native communities. So prior to 1940, there were very few cases of type 2 diabetes, and now it's the 7th leading cause of death for native people, 249% more likely to die of diabetes-related health conditions than other communities. And there are also economic impacts. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey several years ago in which they found that their community spends $8 million a year on food, $7 million of which is spent off reservation. And so as a result of the survey, there's really a push to say, how can we try to keep some of these food dollars within communities rather than having it all heading out? So those are the grim, depressing historical features that have led up to this and some of the grim statistics, but native communities are responding through organizing. Sometimes it's individuals who are continuing on saving seeds and gardens, and in other cases it's community grassroots organizations that are developing as a way of trying to support families who are trying to do this food-related work. And so I got interested and involved in the food sovereignty movement as part of volunteering with this group called Ganahio Yongwaya Dohage, which is We Are Planting Good Seeds, which was based out of Akwesasne, a Mohawk community up on the New York-Canadian border in that area. And the goal of this organization was to try to get more people into gardening, farming, seed saving, and producing their own food. And as part of this, we would be working in the gardens during the day, and then at some of these meetings discussing, like, I wonder how other Native communities are doing this work. How are people getting youth involved? How are people getting funding for these kind of projects? And so this led me on a big adventure, a 20,000-mile road trip around the country over about 4 months, and during which I popped into 40 different Native communities that were doing farming and gardening and seed saving projects to talk to people about how were they getting community involved? How were they getting funding for these kind of projects? What were some of the successes and challenges that they were having? So this is a blog that came out as part of this project, in part because publishing takes a really long time. So I'm still working on the book that this will all be based on, but the blog was a way of showing each other what some of these projects were that were going on, because people were like, well, I wish I could just go around and visit with people all summer long, but somebody has to stay here and weed the garden. And so the blog was a way of letting people see some of the different communities that I had the opportunity to visit. So there was an article that came out of this, You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself, Defining and Enacting Food Sovereignty in American Indian Community Gardening. One of the questions that I would ask people who were part of this project is, how would you define food sovereignty? And because I gave you a definition at the beginning of the presentation based on what La Via Campesina and some of their affiliated folks came up with, but I was interested for people who are on the ground doing this work, how were they defining food sovereignty? And when I broke down their different definitions, it really focused on a restoration of physical, cultural, and spiritual health, recognizing that all of those were in many ways connected to the foods that people were eating, making sure that people had access to culturally appropriate foods specifically, highlighting the relationship between people and each other, between people and the land and people and the food, focusing on individual, community, and whole tribal self-sufficiency and control over where people's food was coming from. There was a real effort toward economic independence for the community, linked again to that survey that I mentioned, where people were recognizing that a lot of the food dollars are being spent on producers outside of the community, making sure people have access to this healthy traditional food. And many of these projects really had a focus on education. So how do you help the rest of the community understand what the project is about and why they should want to take part in this kind of work? And because I was specifically focusing on tribal community farming and gardening projects, there was an increasing effort to focus on heirloom seeds. So not just going to the store and buying seeds every year, but making sure that the seeds that were developed specifically within and for communities were being grown out each year and that people still had access to them. So there we go. And there was a whole variety of situations of seeds in people's communities. So for example, when I stopped in to visit folks in Cochiti Pueblo, Ade Romero started this great group there called the Cochiti Youth Enrichment Project, which was focused on partnering youth with farmers so that they could learn how to grow out some of these foods and have access to this knowledge around how to farm. Jason is her cousin here, and he introduced me to his grandma Percy, who had this amazing assortment of heirloom corns that they grew out every year. And as far as they can estimate, they've always been part of the family. They've never lost access to this corn. So there's fewer and fewer people growing it, and there's a real effort now to make sure that there's enough of this corn being grown out. But there've always been these kind of beautiful corns. And, apparently Percy really liked colorful corns. And so she would make sure that they saved some of these beautiful colors for planting in the garden in the next year. In some cases, there are seeds that have gone away from the community for a bit that are then making their way back. And I'll talk about this more a little bit later on in the presentation. But this was an example where Rowan White, who you see here in the red shawl, who is the chair of the board for the Seed Savers Exchange, which is a big seed program in Decorah, Iowa. She started going through the records and the collections and looking to see what were some native seeds that were part of their holdings there and how could she get those back home. So as part of a Southwest Food Sovereignty Summit, they brought back this beautiful green squash that had been away from the community for about 70 years. And people really welcomed that squash home, and it was really beautiful. So in thinking about heirloom crops and heirloom seeds and how they fit into people's memories and people's motivations for wanting to bring these seeds back, Virginia Nazaria has some great books and articles as part of her long body of work of working with heirloom seed keepers. And she talks about the reattachment of stories and memories to food as being important for biodiversity. And so she really talks about how heirloom crops play a central role in the restoration of landscapes of remembrance. So becoming reattached to the crops that you're planting because of the way that they fit into the broader community memory. Jennifer Jordan talks about this idea of edible memory, so infusing food with connections to the past, both deeply personal and inherently social. So she talks about how food has a unique quality to carry personal and social meaning. Heirlooms, people pass on genotypes, but they also is about consuming other people's memories. So she talks about Alison Landberg's idea of prosthetic memory. So thinking about visceral experience of memories that aren't your own. And this played out in talking to Deb Echohawk, who has worked with her Pawnee community in Oklahoma for a while to bring back some of these heirloom corns, the corns that her community used to have in Nebraska that didn't necessarily make it to Oklahoma when they were forcibly removed. And so she's worked over years trying to bring back, the picture in the background here is an eagle corn, is one of the ones that they worked with. And she described how, after years and years of growing it out so that you have enough seed stock, they finally had enough for a feast. And it went so quickly that she wasn't able to taste it. But her dedication in investing years worth of work to bring back corn that she hadn't herself tasted, but knew that her community deserved to have back in their feasts again as part of their corn soup. So when I ask people, how do you decide what is a heritage seed or an heirloom seed or a native seed? People have all different kind of crops in their gardens. So how do you decide what qualifies as a heritage seed? So some said, okay, we have to decide on it as a community. So people just know, like, this is our corn, these are our beans. Some people say, well, it's passed down through families. That's how you know it's a heritage seed, because your mom grew it, your grandma grew it, her grandma grew it, and that's how you know it belongs there in your family. Some people say, well, there are songs and ceremonies that are done for heirloom seeds or heritage seeds. So if it's something that's been, in a seed bank and it's been grown out for generations and generations by non-native people, for some communities that wouldn't qualify as a heritage seed in the same way as one that had been sung to and had ceremonies delivered for it. Other people say, well, it's the cultural context and the memory around it that makes it a heritage seed. For some people, they're like, well, community members have been doing a lot of research and they're bringing home these seeds, and we trust that research that they're doing to tell us what our seeds are and which ones we should be focusing on bringing back. And part of what made these special to several of the people that I spoke with was that they felt by holding these seeds and working with these seeds and eating these seeds, the genes in those seeds connected them to their ancestors, to previous generations of seed keepers, because everything about how that seed looks and tastes and grows is the result of years worth of grandmas selecting out what they want for that particular seed. And so they felt that planting these seeds connected them to those previous generations. People were adamant that you should really not be dousing these with chemicals, that they should be grown in these kind of more traditional organic ways. And the notion that they also shouldn't be static. And so there's an effort to balance wanting to keep these heirloom seeds the way they are, but then also selecting for what works now as far as this climate, as far as what's going to grow well in your particular soil, as far as what your family will enjoy eating. And when I ask people, so why is it important to plant and save heritage seeds specifically? People felt that it establishes a cultural connection to planting in a different way than if you're just buying seeds from the store. There's a highlighting of a ceremonial context for many of these seeds and these foods that you can make from those particularly. There's a desire to connect seeds and the land. So here, this photo here, the Dream of Wild Health project in Minnesota was eager to plant Dakota seeds on the land where the project is set up, because this is Dakota land. And so they said these seeds deserve to be back on that land that they were developed for. People also felt that it reestablished this connection to their ancestors, to be growing these seeds that their ancestors developed. And people also saw them as more nutritious than some of the conventional crops that you might be able to buy seeds for. And it also gave people the feeling of being independent from industrial agriculture, from this commercial system, that instead they were able to save their own seeds and trade those seeds among other community members. So, we talked a bit about food sovereignty. Within that, the idea of seed sovereignty includes the rights of farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-saved seed, which is kind of valued over plant breeders and agrochemical firms' intellectual property rights. So now people are facing challenges when it comes to saving seeds to not run afoul of some of these intellectual property systems. So the idea of seed sovereignty is saying, well, that's not as important as people's rights to be able to save their seed, use, exchange, and eat it for how they like. When I asked some of the seed savers that I talked to, like, how would you define seed sovereignty? This is Clayton Brocope, you see here holding a handful of corn at one of the food summits that was out at GJAC several years back. And he is one of the founders of the Traditional Native American Farmers Association out of his wife's community of Tesuque Pueblo. And he defined seed sovereignty as protecting our living relatives so they can't be molested, contaminated, or imprisoned. And by molested, he said, if somebody's taking apart your living relative on a genetic level, doing that kind of genetic research, he saw that as molesting that living relative, that seed. And contaminated, if there's pollen that is blowing in from genetically modified cornfields, then it could be contaminating your seed stock. Or imprisoned, he said, if somebody comes along and patents your seed, that changes the way that you're able to just exchange it, sell it, do what your community think is best with it. And he saw that as tantamount to imprisoning that seed. He focused on the inherent right to save seed and pass it on to future generations. And then Rowan White, who's another Mohawk seed keeper, defined seed sovereignty as the ability to define our relationship to that seed based on our own values and not the values of anyone else outside of our community. So one of the ways that some communities are working to protect seeds is through indigenous seed banks. So this is a little bit different than some of the large seed vaults that you might heard of. For example, the Svalbard vault is trying to keep a copy of all the seeds up there in the permafrost. These instead are based right within communities, so people have easier access to them. This is in Tesuque Pueblo, this is wonderful cob building, and down deep in the basement is where all these seeds are kept in this very cool, nice dry setting. But people are then able to grow them out as they see appropriate and have easy access to them right there within the community. There are also organizations that are developing, like the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, to try to help more people to learn about seed saving, growing gardens specifically for seed saving, giving these opportunities for seed exchanges so that people can be growing out these seeds and then also getting a little genetic input from their neighbors' seed collections. And they develop these seed packets for some of the seeds that are exchanged as part of these gatherings. And there's also been increasingly efforts around seed rematriation. So you've probably heard of the term repatriation, which is often used to describe prisoners of war that are being sent back to their home country, or under the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, ancestral remains, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony that are returned home to the tribal nations from which they were taken. So it's really this kind of one-way arrow process of things that were taken away that shouldn't have been, that are then sent home to be kept there. So people within the seed saving movement have highlighted this idea of rematriation as a way of, it sounds a little less patriarchal, right? So a way of acknowledging the women seed keepers, the grandmas who helped to hang on to these seeds throughout the years. And it's seen as a much more circular process. So connecting Indigenous people to these seeds, connecting the seeds back to the land that they were originally developed for, and in the process, reconnecting people and the land. And so it's this continuous circular process of connecting seeds, people, and the land. So some of the different seed rematriation projects that have been happening out there, one of the earlier ones I think was with the Science Museum of Minnesota. This is Scott Shoemaker, who used to be a curator there. He's from the Miami tribe. And so within this museum, they went in and looked at the different native seeds that had been collected over the years and tucked away on the shelves. And so why don't we try growing some of these out and seeing if they'll sprout? And so there's a garden there on the grounds of the Science Museum where some of these seeds were sprouted. And then the offspring of those fresh, nice new seeds sent back to the communities from which they were collected. They also collaborated with organizations like Dream of Wild Health that I mentioned earlier to grow out some of these seeds on the farm and then get them back to people. The Seed Savers Exchange, as I mentioned previously, where Rowan White has been working to reconnect Native communities to those seeds there. So this was a gathering that was held a few years ago to bring Native seed keepers from different communities together to find out more about the farm there in Decorah and the efforts to grow those seeds out and send them home. The University of Michigan has also been working, the Matai Botanical Center there, the Zibuing Center, and MACPR, which is the Michigan organization of tribes that are working to have things repatriated. So all these entities have been working together in discussions of returning some of the seeds that are part of the university's collections back to Native communities, and starting with this garden there at the Botanical Gardens to grow out heirloom seeds from local tribes. The Hudson Valley Farm Hub and this wonderful organization Seed Shed, started by Kay Green, is collaborating with Rowan White and others from Akwesasne to develop this Native American seed sanctuary in the Hudson Valley. And it was a way of reconnecting Mohawk heirloom seeds with land that they would have been farmed on a couple hundred years ago before settlers appropriated much of this very nice farmland. So over the last couple of years, there have been different heirloom seeds that have been selected that the community felt that they didn't quite have enough of, that is then grown out on this land. And then all of the beautiful resulting seed sent up to Akwesasne for food, for people's gardens, and for distribution there. And as I mentioned earlier, Deb Echohawk helped to found the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project. And as part of this, she partnered up with Ronnie O'Brien, who is a non-native farmer up in Nebraska, who reached out because she wanted to help Pawnee people to be able to be connected to their land in Nebraska. And so some of the seeds that Deb initially got back didn't grow well in Oklahoma. They weren't used to being there. And so she has worked with Ronnie and other farmers over the years to grow out enough seed in Nebraska to then be able to bring it down to Oklahoma and gradually get it used to this newer setting. And so now through this organization, you can buy food that has come out of this seed project. So blue corn flour makes really delicious mush and cornbread and other kinds of treats based on these seeds that Deb has worked really hard to get back and grow out. And then a project that I've been involved with in collaboration with the Field Museum is getting some of these seeds that were collected 100 years ago by the first Native anthropologist, William Jones, back to the Meskwaki tribe in Iowa, where they were collected from. So this has now become the basis of an exhibit. When the Field Museum reopens the Native American Hall, there is an exhibit there about the Meskwaki food sovereignty initiatives that will include some of the story of these seeds that sat in the museum for 100 years and then a few years ago made their way back to the Meskwaki community. And then a last example here, this is Amos Hinton, who for a couple of years ran the Ponca agricultural program out of Oklahoma. The Ponca tribe was relocated out of Nebraska from this area in 1877, that now Art Tandrup and his family have a farm there. And so when people were concerned about the Keystone Pipeline carving its way through Nebraska, the Ponca linked up with Art Tandrup and his family and as part of the Seeds of Resistance project, and ended up planting some of their heirloom corns in the path of the pipeline in a collaboration between non-native ranchers in the area and Ponca people from Nebraska and from Oklahoma who came together to stand in the way of this pipeline and hope to ensure that it wouldn't come through. So in conclusion, just to reiterate that heritage seeds are an integral part of agriculture for Indigenous communities, for Native food sovereignty projects that are really focused on farming and gardening. They're an important part of the health and resilience of communities that really their heritage is based on farming and gardening. I want to reiterate that efforts to protect some of these heirloom seeds go beyond being anti-science. I think a lot of times people assume that if somebody is against the genetic modifying of seeds or the patenting of seeds, it's just because they don't understand science. And as you can see here, people have a lot more invested culturally and emotionally in these seeds than just being anti-science. It's really about trying to protect these seeds, these relatives that connect people culturally and to their ancestors. There's an importance of seed rematriation to the seed sovereignty effort. So relinking seeds that have been removed from communities and sending them back home. And part of Rowan's work, and you see her hands here alongside her friend Kay Green. One of my favorite things when hanging out with farmers and seed keepers is to say, what's in your pockets right now? And so when I asked the two of them on one of my visits to the Native Seed Sanctuary, what's in your pockets? These are what they pulled out. And so, Rowan through her work has really highlighted the importance of mending, creating, and restoring relationships and the way that seeds have been able to do that for some communities. So in thinking about going forward, how can you apply some of these lessons in your own work? I really encourage you to read some of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work about polycropping knowledge. So thinking about Three Sisters Gardens and how can that provide a good model for collaborative work. And so she writes about how there's a need for a mutualism in which the climbing beans of scientific inquiry are guided by the maze of Indigenous principles, and then the squash represents educational climate of mutual respect, intellectual pluralism, and critical thinking in which both traditional environmental knowledge and scientific environmental knowledge can grow. And so you can see from this demonstration, this is the Pawnee garden that Deb Echohawk and her crew planted in Oklahoma. So Kimmerer really calls on us to think about how scientific environmental knowledge and your own fields of architecture and design and other Western fields can really look to Indigenous communities for some guidance, especially if you're working in and for Native communities. I'd also just want to draw your attention to a book that was edited by Damama Hesua and myself that came out a few years ago that has, it's called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, that has some chapters written by seed savers and farmers and chefs and lawyers and professors and everybody in between. So thank you very much. I look forward to continuing to talk with you about these issues. Thank you.